In these episodes, we're talking about how from Psalm 37:23, the Lord establishes our steps. In this episode, we're going to talk about how in every step, God is instructive, so trust His Word. Even though we live in a cruel and evil world in which it's easy to take missteps and make mistakes, God's Word remains a sufficient guide, a source of instruction to establish our steps. God's Word prepares us and supports us for life in a world that's antagonistic to our faith. Trusting God and becoming a student of His Word doesn't mean that you become aloof to the world. It doesn't mean that you ignore reality or put on a fake smile and walk aimlessly, sanctifying stupidity by simply saying, well, whatever happens, I trust God. If you read Psalm 37, you get a very real sense that the writer understands the difficulty of the culture in which he's living. The threats are very real. The wicked really do plot against the righteous, Psalm 37:12. The idea that they gnash their teeth at him may be somewhat of a metaphor, but there's actual pain involved. It really does hurt. In verse 14, the wicked draw the sword and bend their bows to bring down the poor and needy. This phrase describes much of the injustice and tragedy we see going on in the world today. Trusting God doesn't exempt us from suffering. From time to time, we're going to be required to walk through some things that we will not enjoy. Even still, God establishes our steps. God's providence isn't a sedative that dulls our sense of reality. If anything, God's providence helps bring sobriety to our walk and gives us wisdom to see what's really there. In the last episode, we said the word providence means to see before. If this is true, then God's Word helps me see what is ahead. Those who walk with God don't take the world they see at face value. They consult God's Word so that they can see through the situation at hand. Because they are instructed by God's Word, their steps aren't based on where they are now, but on where the step may take them later. To see through the circumstances rather than reacting to our circumstances is critical to our journey of going further walking with God. People who trust God's Word aren't easily deceived. They look at a situation thoroughly to make sure that a minor misstep doesn't lead to a tragic mistake. Now in my 40s, I'm not the adventurer that I once was. I've learned that now that I'm older and bigger, I hit the ground harder. When I was in college, I had a friend who enjoyed rock climbing and rappelling. I went with him a few times to a rock ledge on the side of Lookout Mountain in Chattanooga, Tennessee, known as Eagle's Nest. In my childhood, I was a Boy Scout. Boy Scouts are all about safety. I'd been rappelling several times off a tower at summer camp, but that was different. There I had an instructor to constantly check my equipment and a person attached to the rope at the bottom called a belay. At Eagle's Nest, there's no instructor. There's no belay. It's just you, a rope, rocks, and air between the top and the bottom of the cliff. My friend and I tied off to a sturdy tree. We dropped the rope over the ledge and attached ourselves to separate lines. Even though I had made a few descents already, something just didn't feel right about the way I hooked in this particular time. Just before I leaned over the edge and took the first step, something told me I needed to take a minute and look things over. I looked the equipment over several times and couldn't see a problem. Because of my hesitation, my friend Jonathan asked me what was going on, and he took a look at my setup. It's been many years ago, and I can't remember exactly what I did wrong, but essentially I had threaded the rope through in the wrong direction. Something as small as the direction of the rope would have changed everything. A minor misstep on the edge of a cliff almost became a huge mistake in my life. God's Word is instructive. You have enough information available in any situation to make the right decision. Don't ignore the details of your situation or of the instruction of God's Word. Like climbers and rappellers, you need a checklist that will help you not only see the situation, but to help you think through it. You need to be able to discern what's there. I mentioned several of those directives in the last episode that are in Psalm 37, but there are also 5 commands in Psalm 37 that become instructive in our steps. To make certain you're not about to make a mistake, ask yourself these questions to be certain you're obeying God's commands. Before you take a step, ask yourself, can I take this step and remain faithful? Look at Psalm 37:3. Will the decision feed faithfulness, or will it lead to my faith becoming weak and anemic? Take a look at Psalm 37:4 and ask this question, can I take this step with the right attitude? The writer says to delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart. You can't make a good decision based on bad information. I believe you also can't make a good decision with a bad attitude. A lot of us make decisions based on frustration and annoyance. We avoid people and situations and masquerade it as the call of God on our lives. This is fretting yourself, and as we discussed in the last episode, it's a poor basis for decisions, and it will lead you to a huge mistake. The verse says that if you delight in the Lord, He'll give you the desires of your heart. I think it's interesting that the note at the beginning of Psalms tells us that David wrote it. The Bible records an interesting decision David made based on the delight of his heart in 2 Samuel 7. David determined that because the Lord had been so good to him, prospering him and giving him rest from all his enemies, that he would build God a temple. In consulting the prophet Nathan about the decision, Nathan gives David some interesting advice. Go do all that's in your heart, for the Lord is with you. 2 Samuel 7, verse 3. David's attitude in the situation was right. He wanted to do something that honored the Lord. Nathan discerned that David's heart was right. Nathan was essentially saying to David that he walked so closely to the Lord and was so intent on obeying His word that what was on his heart was most likely what was also on God's heart. Yet David found out that God didn't have the construction of the temple as his next step. For various reasons, that would be a step God would have David's son take. Yet David found out later that God didn't have the construction of the temple on his heart. It wouldn't be David's next step. For various reasons, that would be the step that David's son would take. Yet God honored David's heart by making a covenant with him that would establish his throne forever. That passage is so instructive to us in affirming that when we delight ourselves in the Lord, He will inform our heart. You and I have a lot going on in the day. There may not be time to pray and wait on every decision. If God's providential in every step, how does that walk not become this slow, cumbersome march in which we're paralyzed by every variable and every detail? David learned that if his delight was in the Lord, he could have confidence in making the next step. If it wasn't the step that God wanted him to take, the Lord would instruct him before he made a mistake. Another question to ask is, can I take this step and remain committed? Look at verse 5. The verse says, commit your way to the Lord, trust in Him, and He will act. As we saw with David's desire to build the temple, the question is simple. Is this my plan or is this God's plan? The word commit here means to throw your burden to the Lord much like a traveler would throw his pack on a mule. Another way of defining the word is to roll away. Put the ball in God's court. If He's providential, the burden of the next decision is His, not yours. Trust in Him, He will act. Here's another question for you. Can I take this step without being rushed? Look at verse 7. There are two directives in this verse that are counterintuitive to the hurried pace of our life. How can we possibly be productive if we be still and wait patiently? The contrast in this verse is that of a world in turmoil. It's the godless going nuts. Two of the favorite words of our culture seem to be rush and push. Everything is pushed on us. In an image-driven, media-saturated culture of instant information, we are rushed and pushed instead of being allowed to process and make a proper decision. My friend Rennie Scott has a wise saying pertinent for this point. He says, Satan pushes, God leads. In the midst of the chaos is a calm that characterizes those who trust a good providential God at His word. As we saw in the chapter on pace, there is more to the Christian walk than miracles. The Christian walk is more about what God teaches us in the waiting. Here's another question. Can I take the next step with pure, unselfish motives? Look at Psalm 37:8. What's true of attitude also holds true for motive. We can't make good decisions with bad attitude. We talked about that. But this verse takes it a step further. It's impossible to take the right step for the wrong reason. Anger, wrath, and fret, according to the psalm, tend only to evil. Apple seeds don't produce orange trees, and sinful motives will not yield righteous results. The early spring seems to bring with it an infestation of wasps inquiring about nesting at my house. We have a covered, screened-in back porch. Due to the way it's built, it's easy for wasps to come up through the floor and then remain trapped inside the screen. Apparently, those bugs have very short memories. They're great at the entrance. They are horrible at the escape. Along with our family of rocking chairs sits a can of wasp spray. We usually place the can on a ledge that's attached to the screen, and there are times that the can, the screen, and the fatally trapped wasp make for a most ironic scene. So many times the wasps crawl up the screen beside the can that contains for them 20 ounces of instant death. Minor misstep, big mistake. Why? Because not only do wasps have short memories, but they can't read. When we fail to spend time in God's Word and be instructed by it, we are prone to take steps into dangerous places. We take what we think to be minor steps, and they become huge mistakes. God's given us the right information in His Word so that we can make the right decisions in a dangerous world. If you want to go far, read God's Word. Thank you for joining me for today's episode of A Walk Through the Summer. Until next time, visit brianbranham.com and check out Back Porch Psalms, 154 video episodes that'll take you chapter by chapter through the Bible's book of Psalms.